So thank you, Michelle. Hi, Managing Editor, American Purpose. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. Good to see all of you. It's a fabulous group. We tried to keep this somewhat participant intensive. I think we'll have at the end of the admission process about 30 or so in the room, and it's a fabulous group. First of all, congratulations, Zach Schrag, on your book, 2021, The Princeton Guide to Historical Research. Thanks, Peter Doherty, for bringing this important book to our attention. It's thanks to you that we're able to recruit and schedule Zach. And Kate Epstein. We have two distinguished historians, Kate from Rutgers and a member of the American Purpose editorial board, has kindly agreed to lead the conversation and for the first 20 or 30 minutes, ask Zach questions. I think this is an important book, and I think this is an exceptionally important topic in time because of the so-called history wars, and to have a straight and professional, and if I may say, clinical approach to what do we understand by history? What is its utility? How does it change our understanding? And for historians, between storytelling, analysis, and a range of methods, how does one go about one's business in a professional, responsible sort of way? There's lots to this. These are the two best people, to my mind, to talk about this. If you don't have Zach's book, please buy it, read it. I commend it to you. And Kate, you have the floor, and thank you for doing this for us.
All right. Well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Jeff and Michelle and American Purpose for putting this together and inviting me to moderate. It's good to see some friends out in the audience. And I have the pleasure of introducing Zach Schrag. My name is Kate Epstein. I'm a history professor at Rutgers-Camden. As someone who loves teaching classes in historical methods, which I think is kind of a love it or hate it thing, I love it. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Zachary Schrag, professor of history at George Mason University and the author of the Princeton Guide to Historical Research, much more exciting than the Princeton Guide to SATs and so forth. This is his fourth book. It's just come out with Princeton University Press. Zach is a distinguished historian of cities, having written books on both the Washington, D.C. metro system, with which many of us will be familiar, as well as the Philadelphia riots of 1844. He's also a historian of the social sciences in the United States. His work has appeared in too many journals to count, and he's the rare historian to bridge the worlds of academia and policymaking, which is something I hope we'll be talking about today. And it's a real pleasure to welcome him to American Purpose. As Jeff said, the format today is that I'm going to start things off by asking Zach a few questions about his new book to sort of get things started, and then we'll open it up to Q&A after about 20 to 30 minutes. So one of the things you learn from studying history is that every book has a story, has a history of its own. And so I'd like to begin by asking Zach, what made you write this book now?
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for hosting and everyone for attending. This book has two origin stories. One starts in my early days as a graduate teaching assistant at Columbia University and working with students there, and very good students at Columbia and Barnard, but some of them were struggling with what I considered some basic conventions, like how do you structure an essay? What does a thesis statement look like? Not because they were incapable of grasping the concepts, but simply because no one had told them. And so I started writing out some handouts rather than responding to every student. I would put out a handout that would go to the whole class. And there was this new technology out there called the World Wide Web. And I had learned, several tags of HTML so I could write a website by hand. So I started posting these online for everyone to see. Well, I kept doing this, a few times a year. And, by the 2010s, I had about 20,000 words on a website called historyprofessor.org and had a good sense of how I would explain different historical concepts. And at that point, Peter Dougherty, who's on the call from Princeton University Press, approached me and said, we're looking for someone to write a guide to historical research. I understand you've already, done parts of this. Would you like to expand it into a book? And I thought about it, and I thought, yeah, there are many other topics I'd like to address, and I know how to do it, which is I kind of know what I like to do, which is read stuff, figure out my favorite parts of those books or articles or museum exhibits, and say nice things about those. So it's a book with a lot of love in it for what my fellow historians have done.
Sorry, I always have to remember to unmute. It's really the range of examples is really striking. I mean, you're pulling from a ton of different fields of or sort of subfields of historical research in the book. Okay, so thanks for that. The next question I'd like to ask is one that's already come up, and it has to do with the relationship between the study of history and the world of policymaking. One of my favorite parts of the book was a section that you titled, quote, "The Perils of Policy Prescriptions." So I'd like to ask, why is policy prescription so perilous? And what would be the point of studying history if not to inform contemporary policy in some way?
So, I think that history can certainly inform us, but as historians, we are devoted to a concept of contingency, which is things can turn out differently depending on the choices that people make. A great example of this right now is back in college, I took a course on the history of Ukraine. And I remember, writing my final exam, and this was 1989 or so, saying, I wasn't too sure that Ukraine could ever achieve independence because it seemed like Russia really wanted access to the Black Sea. And, the next year, to whatever, Ukraine achieves independence for the first time in centuries. And I thought, well, that was a really poor exam answer. And then, then later on, Russia seized Crimea and now is threatening Ukraine again. And I'm thinking, actually, that's a pretty good exam answer that I wrote. So we can't foresee the future. What we can do is have some sense of what the possibilities are, that things have been tried in the past. They've worked well, they've worked poorly. We know how people might respond to something like mandatory vaccinations. And that will give us some idea of what we might expect, not what we will expect, but what we might expect if we make certain policy prescriptions going forward.
Thank you for that. So the next question I'd like to ask has to do with another section of your book. So there's a terrific passage about how to write about bad guys in history. You quote the actor Lee Marvin, who of course specialized in playing convincing villains. And you quote Marvin as having said, quote, "I don't play bad people. I play people struggling to get through their day, doing the best they can with what life's given them." And you then write, quote, "The best historians follow Marvin, doing their best to explain human behavior not as the result of someone trying to do evil, but of people doing the best they can with what life has given them." And there's a couple of questions I'd like to ask you about that passage. But I guess the first one would be to ask you to just kind of elaborate a little bit about what you mean by the words you wrote there.
So there are a few references in the book to another great figure, John Staudenmeier, who was the longtime editor of the journal Technology and Culture. And one of the best things that happened to me professionally ever was having an article early on accepted to Technology and Culture and working with John Staudenmeier on that. Just a fantastic mentor and editor. And one of the points he extracted from the readers' reports on that was that I had this figure, John Hylan, possibly the worst mayor of New York City ever, who either the reader or Staudenmeier said I had treated him as a kind of cartoon villain. I hadn't really tried to see things from Hyland's point of view or explain his behavior. And what Staudenmeier said to me is, that's where you focus your research. You focus your research on the people whose actions you understand the least and give them their best shot. That does not mean that you agree with them. I did more work on Hyland. I still think that he was not very bright and kind of doing what William Randolph Hearst told him, and Hearst's own politics are kind of bizarre. The villain of the Metro book is Congressman Natcher of Kentucky. I flew out to Kentucky and read his diaries, gave him the best chance to speak for himself, and ended up thinking, no, this man was kind of vain and racist, and I'm going to say that. But I'd given him the chance, he had passed away, but I gave him the chance by reading his diaries to speak for himself. Obviously, historians of slavery, historians of the Holocaust have, a much deeper level of this challenge, trying to understand what would make someone think that they could enslave another person or, send thousands of people to their deaths. But if we just think that they woke up and started the day trying to do evil, I don't think we will understand the phenomena of slavery or genocide very well at all. We need to try to understand people's behavior the way they understood it, even if we end up condemning it.
I guess one quick follow-up question I have is, one of the things that constantly frustrates me about the current state of political discourse in the United States is, historians routinely leap centuries and continents in a single bound, which surely a greater imaginative distance separates us from medieval French peasants compared to some of our fellow Americans today. And yet the imaginative effort, or lack thereof, that goes into kind of trying to see things through other people's eyes, even when you really don't like them, is to me one of the most important things that the study of history can do, is really just kind of cultivate the empathetic muscle, so to speak. How do you think the historical profession is doing in terms of sort of trying to see the world through the eyes of some pretty nasty people? It makes me think, as I have mentioned to you, one of the other parts of your book that jumped out at me that I really liked was you write about how a lot of awards in the historical profession these days go to stories of oppression and suffering and injustice, which there's certainly no shortage of in the past U.S. history and other countries' histories alike. But you say, we also need stories, happy stories, stories where the system worked or where a good outcome was produced. Perhaps I'm reading too much into it, but I was thinking as I was reading this, I suspect he has some thoughts about kind of the current state of the historical profession on that score, which would perhaps be related to the passage about seeing the world through the eyes of people you don't really like. So was I off base there? Can you talk
I think
a little
you're
bit
raising several related questions,
Okay.
which is, one is the big question of empathy. And as you say, imagining people across centuries is hard, across distances is hard, but also across identities. We hear stories about novelists who are trying to write with protagonists who have a different gender or different sexuality or different race or socioeconomic status. That's hard. It's hard to imagine things the way other people see them. And historians have the added challenge of not meeting medieval peasants, right? We can and really for the most part having nothing that they wrote. We may have archaeological evidence, we may have things that princes and priests wrote about them, but very little about these illiterate peoples, whether they're from distant places or times. So that's really hard. And then the added layer of that is, how do you write about people whom whose politics you don't share or whom you despise? And one way to deal with that I think is important, but also a bit limiting, is to root for the underdog. A lot of historians really enjoy writing underdog stories. I am no exception. When I've got my other book that came out last year is about these anti-Irish riots that took place in Philadelphia in 1844, and absolutely, I kind of admire the Irish for putting up with that and defending their homes and churches more than I admire the people who were running this anti-Catholic riot against them. So it's very tempting, and I think those stories are important. Obviously, I think the story of Irish resistance to oppression is important. That said, one of the ways that a profession as a whole can perhaps distort the past is by picking and choosing which stories it tells. And in the 19th century, overwhelmingly, the stories that academic historians told were of rich, powerful white men and the projects they completed. And, I think we still have some of those, but perhaps the pendulum has swung too far the other way to only or primarily telling stories of underdogs. And that leaves policymakers with a impoverished sense of what is possible. The historian Alex Wellerstein has written about this. He's a historian of the nuclear age, and he says, politicians just love to talk about a Manhattan Project for this or a Manhattan Project for that. And let me tell you, the Manhattan Project was secretive. It almost failed. It left this environmental legacy of pollution. Like, that's not really the best or only model that we can take up. Why do we have a war on terrorism and a war on crime and a war on drugs? It's because policymakers only think of military history, and they're not thinking about other kinds of models for that. And then a third one, of course, is the moonshot, which took up 2% of GDP for a decade. And again, like, that actually might be appropriate for something like climate change. If you tell me we're going to spend 2% of GDP to avoid climate change, I might actually be for that. But for a lot of other things, a moonshot is not a great metaphor either. So it'd be nice to have more stories that we could tell about success in the past, whether it's government, whether it's business, whether it's nonprofit organizations, people doing good things that we would like to imitate.
That's really, I'm a huge fan of an article. You probably know William Leuchtenberg's classic article on FDR's use of kind of military language and military metaphors to justify the New Deal. And it's really striking, particularly in FDR's first inaugural, just how militarized the language is. That's certainly one of my pet peeves is the cyber Pearl Harbor. And all of these really ill thought through kind of historical analogies and historical metaphors that really just haven't been subjected to kind of careful scrutiny. So speaking of careful scrutiny, one of the other parts of your book that to me was unexpected but delightful was the spirited defense that you mount of the 5-paragraph essay as the basic building block of the universe, with apologies to atoms. And I wondered, that's there's been a trend kind of within the historical profession, as you well know, to kind of allow students to, do other types of projects, to do video essays and what have you. It's a trend that I have resisted because I think that there are things I usually assign 4 to 6 page papers. There are things that type of paper does that sort of cognitively and rhetorically that no other genre of writing or self-expression kind of allows you to do or requires you to do. So I was just, I read that and I was like, amen, brother. But just what made you kind of write that?
You're entirely right that part of this is a dialogue. Perhaps I'm stated with, sometimes I state it, who I'm arguing with, and I could name names. But yes, there are some people who are advocating for more free-form writing, others who assign what they call unessays, where students can write cartoons or put on plays or do podcasts or create other kinds of storytelling or not even narrative. Some of these are objects. And clearly those all have a place. Historians, can be found in lots of places, thinking about, again, board games or museum exhibits. But at some level, I think the 5-paragraph essay, first of all, it's important for itself. Even if a student never writes another 1,000-word piece, they're going to be consumers, we hope, of op-eds and pitches and other kinds of brief summaries of arguments, and they need to be able to dissect those. They need to be able to say, what is the argument, what is the claim, what are the assumptions, what's the evidence? And the best way to do that is by writing some of those themselves. And then also these essays become building blocks for other materials, whether they are longer papers, even books. My book has 5 parts, or again, other genres. I've worked with museum designers and they have a certain amount of space and a certain number of rooms, and each room has to have a theme. And that's very much like a paragraph in an essay. Every paragraph does its own work and then transitions into the next one, the way you might move from one museum room into the next. We can go back to Lee Marvin and the movies. Movies have act structures, which of course derive from plays. Shakespeare plays have how many acts? 5. And, so 5 is a great number. 3 is a great number as well. I've got, 5 paragraphs. You've got the introduction and conclusion. In between, there's this idea, what's the relationship, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And so you're actually training in logic as well as length. So again, I am not disparaging these other works, but we do lose something if we throw out the 5-paragraph essay entirely.
Right. Okay. Can I ask you, just as, and I think this is kind of the last question I'll ask before we open it up. And I guess it's, Jeff alluded to the history wars at the beginning. And can I ask you, just as a, this is a huge question, and in some ways a dangerous one, but how do you think the historical profession is doing in the history wars? What might we be doing well? What might we be doing poorly?
So, I think we're doing what we can in trying to explain our process in terms of evidence. One great example of this is a few years back. I mean, there's this resurgence, unfortunately, of what we call the lost cause myth, defending the Southern secession and the Confederacy. And part of that myth is that the Southern states seceded for some reason other than to defend slavery, tariffs, states' rights, you name it. And so the American Historical Association just said, okay, here's every declaration of secession that every Southern state made. They never had a unified Declaration of Independence the way the United States did in 1776. Confederacy never managed that. But we do have individual state declarations. And if you read them, they're like, yeah, we want to keep people enslaved. That's what they're there for. And you have the cornerstone speech describing the inferior of African Americans, that kind of thing. So, that was an effort by the profession to say, however you want to interpret these documents, you need to read these documents and then tell me what the Civil War secession was about. So there are efforts at that. Unfortunately, this is limited in certain ways. First of all, no set of documents. I mean, those are pretty clear documents, but in general, documents do not speak for themselves as clearly. If you want to read that back into current debates about slavery and the American Revolution, it gets muddier. Certainly, American patriots in 1775, 1776 are talking about slavery, but they're not saying things about slavery in anything like the clarity of those secession documents of 1860. So, those documents don't speak for themselves. They need interpretation. And then another big tension, I think, within the profession is that historians want to say, yes, we work on evidence. We allow ourselves to be surprised. I think some of my most important work as a historian is reading things that I wasn't expecting to see, that contradicted my prior beliefs and made me think, okay, I have to retell this story based on the evidence I found. That said, there's no question that historians, bring commitments and politics and priorities to their work. And again, I think that it's can be hard for historians to explain to the wider world that, yes, at one point, we're letting the evidence take the story where it goes. On the other hand, probably no evidence is going to, really change our mind that the civil rights movement was a good thing, right? That we might think differently about how we got there, but again, we are intervening in the world, and some will say, fairly explicitly, I wrote this book to give voice to these people whom I care about, or to try to achieve some kind of change in the world that I would like to see. And that's honest, but it also opens up the challenge from people who don't share those politics or priors, that we are just fitting the facts to our preconceived notions, which is not what we're supposed to be doing.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'd like to open it up to Q&A now. I know we have a question from Nicole Penn. So if I could call on her first and then invite others to kind of use the hand raise feature in Zoom. Nicole, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you both for this magnificent conversation. This is such an important topic. I'm just for a bit of background, I'm a program manager at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm also on the editorial board here at American Purpose. And I have a master's in history, and I wish that I'd had Dr. Schrag's book when I was a graduate student. I would have really benefited. Seems like an excellent resource. But I want to ask about the difficult topic of civic education. Are history and civic education two different disciplines, or are they, interbound up in each other? How should we treat the concept of civic education, which seems to demand for some kind of unified history that, as you all have pointed out for various reasons, can be difficult to reach? So I'm wondering what you think of these two disciplines, and if they are two disciplines, and if that kind of, and if they're melded, if that's maybe at the heart of some of the rancor that we're seeing, particularly in the secondary and primary school systems. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's certainly hard for me to imagine an effective civic education that didn't have some historical component, because history is how we figure out what our American purpose is, right? What we're trying to achieve here, look back at our founding documents and the people we celebrate. And unless we have, some kind of view of what past generations were trying to achieve, it's hard to know, who we even are as a nation. And this is true, obviously of other countries as well. If you think about the myth of Romulus and Remus, or the Aeneid, right? That, the Aeneid is an epic story, but it's also something that Romans used to try to understand who they were as a people, where they came from, and where they were going. So it's, I think, hard to imagine a civic education with some kinds of stories. The question I think you're raising is, what kind of stories will those be? Will those be more mythic stories that are unchallengeable by evidence? Will they be more scholarly stories where you say, okay, we've got different interpretations, and especially I think in the younger grades, that could be hard to say, well, there are multiple stories and you have to choose one. What is a 9-year-old going to do with that? And so maybe the answer is to just layer the complexity. I certainly think that by 6th grade, many students are capable of kind of holding both ideas at once, understanding that there is a set of agreed on facts, but also understanding differences. As I've written in the book, I'm a big fan of National History Day, and I've worked with 6th graders, and they are doing this work. They are saying, okay, and certainly by high school. I remember one video I saw by a group of high school students about the neutrality debates of 1916, 1917. And they said, here's the case for intervention in World War I in Congress, and here's the case against it. And they really laid them out just as, the good Lee Marvin way, right? You're trying to see people from their point of view. And as a judge on that, I said, how did you do that? That was really good. And they said, okay, we had 4 people in the team. One sort of wrote out the basic chronology, one researched all the arguments for intervention, one researched all the arguments for neutrality, and the 4th sort of did the video and sound. And that's why it was so good, is they had people arguing within their own group, 100 years later, whether it was a good idea for the US to intervene in World War I. And again, these were 9th, 10th graders, great project. So I do think that certainly by high school, probably by junior high school, students are capable of understanding that the past is contested, that we can use evidence to understand the past better. And I would love to see that spread as widely as possible.
I love that. I am actually, I was the regional director for New Jersey History Day in New Jersey. And it's a huge, the quality of the projects ranges widely, but the good ones are really terrific. I mean, there was one I remember by a young woman, which was unbelievably sophisticated understanding of kind of bureaucratic history. So yeah, it's cool. All right, I see Dr. Tucker's hand raised.
Thank you. I should warn you first that I'm a philosopher of history. And there's always a bit of tension with the professions. I edited, if I can plug, the companion to philosophy of history and historiography for Blackwell, and another book, monograph on knowledge of the past. So I'll just ask you 2 questions that will give you a chance to sort of elaborate a bit more about what you think more theoretically, perhaps. One is the question of phenomenology of historical subject, the empathy part, that arguably first, when there were large historical processes like the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, nationalism, and so on, the people who did it had no idea what they were doing. Nobody in the Renaissance knew that they were doing the Renaissance. It was invented 19th century by Jacob Burkhardt. Same thing for all the other processes. What was going on in their mind during the Industrial Revolution? They were thinking about religious conflicts, Catholics and non-conventional Christians. They didn't understand what they were doing. How important is what goes on in people's mind, especially because we have an incredible ability for self-deception and misrepresenting things. So even if you are able to see things through their eyes, don't you just see how they deceive themselves? And I would just refer to the very recent debate in German between Omer Bartov and Dirk Moses about the interpretation of genocide. Were the people who committed genocide really thinking, as Moses suggests, that they had to achieve absolute security by killing absolutely everybody else? Or were they just self-deceiving and they were evil? They were psychopaths. They just had no capacity to understand others or themselves. Which goes to the other question, whether only dolphins can be marine biologists, whether only people with certain identity can represent their identity, or whether you can understand it from without, especially because people anyway self-deceive themselves so much. And finally, I would just mention Santayana here, because Santayana, everybody remembers that he said, if you don't remember the past, you are doomed to repeat it. That just was half of the argument. The other half of our argument is that if you only live in the past, you just live in this constant trauma. And that's what happens with this constant reduction to Adolf and to Pearl Harbor. These are the two traumas that everybody can share. But it's also misleading because there are very few Adolfs out there. And I'll stop here.
Yeah, wow, this is very challenging, and I will say I've never thought theory was my strong suit, but I did certainly read some in philosophy of history while writing this, and part of the question here is, how do you do more than one thing at once, right? That very simple metaphor would be a pair of binoculars, where the reason it works is that one lens gives you one vision of the distant object, and the other gives you another slightly different image, and your brain, because we have two eyes, can process these into a three-dimensional image. And certainly maybe thinking about someone as rational and thinking of them as emotional and possibly psychopathic at the same time might help us give us a more three-dimensional image. And then if you talk to if we're going to extend the metaphor a bit, if you think about what astronomers do, they don't just use two lenses. They put on filters. They use ultraviolet filters and infrared filters and radio telescopes and look at kinds of light that are imperceptible to the human eye and produce much more detailed models of what's out there in the sky. Similarly, I think that what you talk about imposing filters like the Industrial Revolution on people who did not know that that's what they were doing is a kind of filter that we put on the past. It's not going to give us everything, but it will clarify some of what we know. Part of this is a question of scale. I personally, historians work at sometimes the experience of one person, microhistories, they're often called, or biographies. Sometimes we do things at massive scale. The Annals School gave us many centuries at once. So seeing things that no living individual could see, looking down on the anthill and seeing things that no ant could possibly perceive. And then a lot of history is kind of in the middle. Events taking place over decades within a human lifespan, where you're not necessarily facing those same issues because people were quite aware they were trying to build a civil rights movement or trying to build a New Deal, to bring up another of the examples that came up. So I think part of it is understanding that yes, historians both need to sort of use the hindsight eye, but also cover it up at times and try to see things through the point of view of the people who lived through those experiences. Part of it, I think, is, you yourself are saying you could say that all these people are psychopaths, but we kind of know that most people aren't. So possibly privileging rational explanations first, and only playing the psychopath card when all other explanations have been ruled out. And then the last thing I would say to this is I do think that at some level these kinds of theoretical questions can be a bit paralyzing, when in fact, for a lot of the work that historians do, they aren't front and center. So again, if I'm thinking of the high school students trying to understand the neutrality debate of 1917, those members of Congress knew exactly what they were doing. They were debating neutrality. And so, for a lot of projects like that, we can say there wasn't a longue durée, there weren't psychopaths, they were just people trying to advance their agenda and get through their day, and let's try to understand why they disagreed.
Thanks very much. Does anyone else have questions? I don't see. Oh, okay. Yes. Alan Luxembourg. Good to see you, Alan.
Hi. Okay. So you mentioned the history wars. I'm wondering if we could home in on one great battle in those history wars, and that is the battle between the 1776 Commission appointed by Trump, which seems to have been set up in response to the 1619 Project. So I guess my question is, how do you see that battle? And in particular, how do you see the idea of a government-approved official history of the United States?
Yeah, and this goes back to the civic education question as well, because part of the debate not only with the 1619 Project, but we've got apparently a new rash of book bannings in school libraries. Some of them, relative to history, the graphic history mouse has come up in I think Tennessee, and there are other cases like that. This is very hard. Again, there's a tension between trying to have some kind of common ground, and also understanding the debates. Looking forward, 2026 is going to be 250 years of independence for the United States. What are we going to do about that? Certainly in 1976, there was a lot of debate and contestation about how to remember the revolution, and it could be even more challenging this time. There's certainly no easy answer to this, because again, public schools, especially at some level, we're trying to instill values, shared vocabulary in our students. And it's not at all clear how to do that when the adults are themselves divided about what happened in the past. I do think that at some level it's unfair to even put the 1776 Project, which did not include historians for the most part. I think there may have been one early on who didn't sign on to the final product because it was so wretched, versus 1619, which was a collaboration of very serious scholars and journalists. Not that they got everything right, but they did sort of go through the process of trying to, ask important questions and see what current scholarship said. And, in that sense, I think it was much more honest than the Trump-led response. Again, this is really hard, because I'm not denying that the authors behind the 1619 Project had values that they brought to the project, but some of those values were values of scholarship. Let's look at the evidence. Let's see if we can falsify our beliefs, as good scientists are supposed to do. Part of the tension here in doing history is it does straddle the sciences and the humanities. We're not writing novels. We don't have complete freedom to say anything we want. But no, we're not doing mathematical proofs either. We are trying to persuade and tell a story, very often that persuades. I recently got some pushback. Is history really a story? And I'm going to say yes. History tells stories about people, the choices they made, and that's inevitably going to involve, again, interpretations and values. So it's hard. I can't say that the 1619 Project is utterly persuasive to everyone, or that every essay in that collection is equally persuasive. But it's not just stuff that people are making up either. Part of the problem with the response to that is people are focusing on just a few lines and not looking at some of the other elements in the original New York Times Magazine piece. The one closest to my own work is Kevin Cruz on the result of urban freeways and how they were targeted for minority neighborhoods, overwhelmingly, not everywhere, but in most American cities. If you drive on a freeway, you're driving over the ruins of an African-American neighborhood. And to this day, that has consequences for things, not only the spatial arrangements, but also the differences in household wealth, because African-Americans, lost their homes and were displaced, and that has repercussions today. So I would encourage people to read the 1619 Project. You can see if it's persuasive. If it's not, think carefully about what other evidence you might use, and not just say American history is a happy story and we need to teach it that way.
If I could also, some of the stuff that the Worldwide Marxist website of all places has put up in the way of critiques of the 1619 Project, which I think I'm probably more critical of than Zach. Those are well worth reading too. I think. Does anyone else have questions? I've certainly got more I could ask, but I don't want to take time away from others.
Hey, Kate, if you don't mind, I'll ask one, and
Sure.
it pushes and drills maybe just a little bit deeper as follow on to Alan's question. Zach, you talked a little bit about how historians deal with the bad guy. How do they deal with the good guy in the following way? There's a line in this Bertolt Brecht play, The Life of Galileo, where a character says, "A pity the land that has no heroes." And the reply comes, "Pity the land that needs heroes." It seems to me that part of the history debates today goes to the role of heroes in a nation's development, iconic figures, not perfect individuals, but whether they are part of the story and national narrative, or rather, as we search and identify imperfections, they should be what? Disqualified, maybe, or perhaps demolished physically and otherwise. So this also ties a bit to Nicole Penn's question about the role of the historian in delivering accurate, fair-minded history, and the role of the historian in participating in a responsible way in civic education. You've alluded to some of these things, but I would just love it if you could talk a little bit more or dig a little bit deeper into that for us.
Yeah, thanks. I think what you're touching on is a very important connection between the format of a historical work and its message. And the great example of this is what is sometimes called great man history. And as Priya Satya's recent book, Time's Monster, reminds us, there were literally great man histories. Like you can, in a used bookstore, you can find a book by Theodore Roosevelt about Gouverneur Morris, and why Gouverneur Morris was a great man. And other countries have their own great man histories. And, those served a very didactic purpose. They were, I think in many cases meant to be read by boys and young men, very gendered here, saying, if you live your life right, you too can grow up to be a great man like Gouverneur Morris. In some ways that's nice. That's nice for young people. Today we'd include girls, to have, people to emulate, people who achieve things with their lives. You can sort of say, if I work hard, if I study hard, if I'm kind to people, I can achieve this. And I think there are, really good works along those lines. I'm thinking of Adam Hochschild's book, Bury the Chains, which is about the anti-slavery movement in England. And, he's got a set of characters who really worked very hard, not only, against slavery, but also sort of created, he's got all these lines about how they created our idea of what a social movement can be with a mailing list and logos and all the rest. And we can admire them. The challenge is, what do we do when we know that people are flawed? I don't think Robert E. Lee is a hard case. I think he's mostly known for defending a system of slavery, and that's an easy one. The harder ones are things like Thomas Jefferson, or say Charles Lindbergh, who's in subtle ways being demoted. He did a very brave thing in flying over the Atlantic with very scant knowledge of navigation, among other things. And later in his life, he did some good things too. But there's no question that he, was at the very least more tolerant of Nazism than we would have liked him to be. As soon as you put up a hero, it's very dangerous to know what to do with that person's flaws. And, again, especially in the lower grades, how do you teach elementary school students that, people can have done some admirable things, but also be flawed? Again, I'm more comfortable at high school and up because those students can work with, again, more than one idea at once and say, okay, let's talk about the people that Jefferson enslaved. Let's talk about his efforts at promoting freedom. At my university, George Mason University, we've got, our namesake. He had nothing to do with the university per se, except having lived in Fairfax County, but we are named after someone who himself, wrote about human liberty, even as he was not only enslaving people themselves, but putting in his will that these people would remain enslaved for his children and grandchildren. We've recently reinterpreted the statue of George Mason on campus so that there are inscriptions on 3 sides of the base, and 3 of those are Mason's proclamations on liberty, and the 4th one is an excerpt from his will saying this person should remain in slavery after my death. Again, I would love that to be as widespread an attitude as possible, that we're going to keep that statue, but inscribe it with the complexities. I don't know how widespread that can go. I don't know how young you can push that message, or how widely. The people who are, I think, most upset and calling for the most books to be taken out of the library may not be very receptive to those messages.
Thank you. So we actually have a question in the comments section, which I'll go ahead and just read out from H.G. Calloway. The question is, can we apply concepts like colonialism and neocolonialism to events before the concepts were developed? For example, can we view the War of 1812 as a war against neocolonialism? I think this question actually sort of echoes one of Dr. Tucker's questions earlier.
Yeah, so this is, again, I think a question within the profession of, not only sort of anachronistic terminology, but terminology in general, because one of the differences, I think, between history and a lot of the social sciences and humanities is that you can do history with really very little specialized vocabulary. There are a few concepts we've already talked about: contingency, things could have been differently, could have turned out differently; empathy, trying to understand things from the point of view of historical actors. But especially, I think, US historians and maybe even especially US historians of the United States can do whole careers with like half a dozen jargon words at most, whereas you pick up a sociology journal or an anthropology journal or a political science, something like that, and it's like, wow, I have to get a whole new dictionary for this. So I think a lot of these terms working historians can take or leave. That some of them really find more theoretical works to be more helpful, and part of that can be applying terms from the 21st century to the past, and others say no, that's just not going to work for me. And part of it is understanding that the terminology itself changed. The concept of a colony or the concept of empire is one that does change. So you may need to specify, are you using empire the way we might use it in the 21st century, which is a more expansive version that includes not formal claims of sovereignty. The United States never claimed sovereignty in Afghanistan, but it did have a very massive political, economic, and military presence there, for the duration of the war. So is that imperial? Well, in many ways, it so closely resembles things that were called empire in the 19th century that, yes, I think that's a helpful metaphor, even though technically Afghanistan was not, the United States never claimed it to be sovereign space. So again, I may be cowardly here, but I'm going back to the binocular metaphor where, you close one eye, you close the other side, you see slightly different things. And so if the tool is helpful, that's great. But also understand that, the tool may do more damage than it does good if it's preventing you from seeing things as people saw them in the past.
Thank you. So we have time for at least one, possibly two more questions. The next person up is Fritz Heinzen.
Thank you for an interesting discussion. And one thing I'd like to raise, because we've heard so much about CRT in the classrooms, and we've heard it from right, left, and center. But what I can't find is a sense of really how much is there of critical race theory in classrooms. One side says it's everywhere. All the classrooms are invaded with it. The other side says no. And again, I don't know of a way to measure it. I think it would be very difficult, but do you have a sense? Do you have any sense? Is this running rampant in schools or not, or something in between?
Right. One way you could do it would be to track the, assignment of Derek Bell on syllabi. And I think you'd find, not much of it outside of law schools. On the other hand, a lot of what CRT says is almost common sense at this point for US historians. I gave the example of urban freeways where, if you, again, just look at the maps. I was on one last night driving home on I-295 through Washington, D.C., through the Southwest Quadrant that used to be a Black neighborhood. You can't tell me that was, racially neutral in its effects, because I've done that history and I can tell you it wasn't. That really disrupted a Black neighborhood. Now, mostly those weren't homeowners, but, there were people who had a neighborhood going and were displaced, and a white, population was deliberately moved in. I can cite you the interview where the Corps of Engineers is saying, oh, we're not going to let those people move back. So the, the basic insight of critical race theory is that racism is not simply a matter of personal attitudes, but it's a matter of structures. Some of them are legal structures. Some of them are physical structures, like the highway I drove on last night. And again, we've got this case in Georgia where people are, accusing someone of teaching critical race theory. He's teaching African-American history. I don't know how you do honest American history without noticing that racial discrimination can be embedded in legal and physical structures. I simply don't know how you can do that.
Should we possibly be using a different name for it? Is there
well,
or teaching African-American history? Do we leave it very simply and say
that's what people are doing? They're teaching African-American history. Their critics are saying they're teaching critical race theory. If it weren't critical race theory, it would be Marxism, it would be socialism, right? People can come up with any slur that they want to try to silence people that they don't like. So no, most of the people who are being targeted for teaching CRT are not self-identifiedly teaching CRT. Most of the people in the 1950s and 1960s who were targeted for teaching Marxism were not teaching Marxism, or if they were teaching about Marxism, not trying to indoctrinate their students. So one of the lessons we can learn, I think, from the McCarthy period is that doing the right thing in the classroom is not going to keep you safe from the critics. What will keep you safe from the critics are people in power, people in legislatures and boards of visitors and the rest, who are going to say to the critics, no, I'm sorry, what you say is going on in the classroom is not actually happening, and the labels that you are putting are not helpful. Whatever you say about historians imposing labels like neocolonialism on or industrial revolution on actors who didn't understand that is nothing compared to what some of the critics are putting in terms of labels on what historians are actually teaching. So no, I think that I guess I would say historians are teaching about structural racism, and structural racism is one of the most important things you need to understand about American history. If we are not being able to teach structural racism, you might as well try to tell us we can't teach history with vowels.
Very good, thank you.
Okay, I think our last question is going to be from Jay Weiser. who has asked a question in the comments section, or the chat section. The question is, Joe Biden met with a group of historians who told him that he had the opportunity to emulate FDR in the New Deal and LBJ in the Great Society. How does this analogy drawing affect historians' credibility?
Well, if I understand, I don't remember all the names, but a lot of the historians that Biden met with are, not actual university or scholarly trained historians, or have that as their main identity. I think he was meeting with some law professors, some journalists. One of the tough, again, questions about my work is, how do you define historians? I don't want to be too much of a gatekeeper, but I do think that, people with PhDs in history have something to add to the conversation, and I would love to see them get more White House invitations. I will say that a lot of people I know are very fond of the New Deal and the Great Society as metaphors. I'm probably one of them. My first book was called The Great Society Subway, trying to understand how the moment of the Great Society shaped transit planning in Washington, D.C., and how the idealism of that moment made Metro possible. I do think that, again, it's nice to have stories, as people said, beyond Pearl Harbor and Auschwitz, and the New Deal and the Great Society are both, moments where the United States government did a lot. And, again, even people who are advocates of smaller government, a lot of them will say, yeah, Social Security and Medicare, those things are worth preserving. And those come out of the New Deal and the Great Society, respectively. So I think that's hopeful. I think it's also important to understand the differences. With the New Deal in particular, Roosevelt had these massive majorities in both houses of Congress, which Biden certainly doesn't. It wasn't exactly the same system, as Ira Katz-Nelson has written. There were basically three parties. There were the Republicans, the Northern Democrats, and the Southern Democrats that almost formed separate caucuses. But for a lot of things, FDR was able to push things through because he had that massive, nominal majority in Congress that no Democrat has had since. Lyndon Johnson, most of what he got done was with the fabulous 89th Congress, as he called it, and then after the midterms of 1966, his power was decreased. And I would say, frankly, that if you're thinking about American policy, so much of if one of the big historical distortions, I think, is to look at presidents at the expense of Congress, and that would be a great opportunity for political historians. It's harder because we could talk about archives, but congressmen take to either they dump their papers or they take them back to their districts. So you might have a committee that was doing one work together, and all those papers were in the same congressional office building in Washington in 1966, and now they're just scattered across the country, and it costs a lot of money and time to try to recreate that moment. But no, I think my basic answer is yes. I think it would be great to go beyond the war metaphors to moments where the United States had an effective domestic policy. I would like to see more scholarship, scholarly historians involved in those conversations, and I would like to see more of an attention to what was going on in Congress, and not just at the presidential level.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Zach. Thank you very much for the questions. I think my work here is done. So let me just thank American Purpose again, and Professor Schrag again for being with us today, and turn it over to Jeff Gedman for the last word.
Hey, thank you, Kate, and thank you, Zach. Congratulations on the book and everybody who spent time today. So we're out of time, so I indulge myself. Unfair, but here we are. Zach, 60 seconds. Kate, 60 seconds. Zach, 1619 Project. You suggested a generally positive view. Kate, less than positive. It's so unfair, 60 seconds, but give us a little bit to take forward and chew on. Zach, you first.
Most of the criticism that I've seen of the 1619 Project is about a very small portion of it, which is about the Revolutionary War. I would go back to the New York Times Magazine issue and read the other essays. And I'm going to say, start with the Kevin Cruz essay. He's a Princeton professor, a great urban historian. And that should be your introduction to what we mean by structural racism And then you can figure out, once you've read that essay, whether you think that it's something that should be avoided in our schools.
Zach, thank you. Kate?
Oh, Zach just showed me up and how quickly he did his. I am more critical of the 1619 project. I think that the criticisms that have been leveled against it actually go to more than a small part of Hannah Jones's essay in particular, which I think has come to stand in by sort of way of synecdoche for the whole thing. And I would agree with Zach that there's a problem there. It's a very complex product, not just her. But there's also a reason, I think, why her essay has come to stand in for the whole thing. And were critical race theory limited to kind of structural racism in the ways that you discuss, I completely agree with what you said. But I think sort of what's labeled critical race theory problematically, again, goes farther than what you described and makes claims about identity and so forth in ways that I find very dangerous for kind of the pursuit of historical scholarship.
So, and before we go, Kate, just to make clear for the audience, you are a self-identified conservative. You vote Republican. You support Donald J. Trump, correct?
Yeah, thanks. No, I do not. No, I mean, my politics, I suppose, are complicated, but I viscerally loathe Trump.
And I think this subject is really hard and complicated. And Zach and Kate, I think you did a wonderful job. And let us please continue. Thanks, everybody. Kate, thanks so much. And Zach, again, thanks and congrats on the book.
Thank you so much. This has been great. And thank you especially, Kate. Those were great questions.
Oh, thanks for taking them in good faith.
Thanks. Everybody, thank you.
Thanks.